Okay, hi. Yeah, so I'm going to jump right into it. Evolution and abiogenesis together provide the best explanation for the existence and diversity of life. That's the motion. And we can conclude this based on two characteristics that evolution and abiogenesis share that set them apart from any supposed alternative explanation. The first is that they invoke phenomena that are independently confirmed to be real. So various natural processes, for example, like organic synthesis, molecular self-assembly, genetic mutations, natural selection, to name a few. These are the ingredients for the emergence and the evolution of life as we know it, and they are all independently known through observation and experiment to actually manifest in the real world. The second characteristic that evolution and abiogenesis share is that they rely on what we know are real world mechanisms. So for example, the formation and the breakage of chemical bonds needed to synthesize and replicate organic molecules like RNA or proteins, for example, or the chemical reactions that drive genetic mutations in the first place. These all consist of mechanisms that are known through observation and experiment to also manifest in the real world. So again, what sets evolution and abiogenesis apart from any other explanations is that the requisite causal phenomena and the underlying mechanisms are known to be part of the real world. Abiogenesis explains the existence of life in the first place through a series of intermediate steps that may appear to be directed toward a goal, but in reality, the end product of one spontaneous chemical reaction can simply serve as the starting point for another one. So even spontaneous chemistry can give the illusion of being directed toward a goal. So if the conditions are favorable, like when it comes to temperature and pH and so on, chemical reactions can synthesize organic building blocks like amino acids or nucleotides, which can then serve as building blocks for larger structures through what we call molecular self-assembly. And in some cases, organic structures like these can catalyze the reactions that generate additional copies of themselves. In other words, they can self-replicate. Occasional copying error during replication is generally what we refer to as a mutation. And once we have a population of mutating replicators, natural selection is able to occur, resulting in a gradual evolution of complexity and diversity as nature selectively propagates only a limited subset of all the mutations that occur. I'll just go ahead and say real quick, evolution explains all the diversity of life through common descent, but that might be something that we'll have to reserve for part 2 of this debate, depending on what my opponent has to say. And since I'm running out of time, I think I'll leave it there and turn it over to you.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. And yeah, so I want to focus more so on the abiogenesis aspect of it for this debate. And so looking at that premise that abiogenesis provides the best explanation for the existence of life, that's a very powerful statement, and that I just frankly disagree with. I think there's better explanations than abiogenesis, and then the idea, assuming that abiogenesis, we're assuming from naturalistic processes, living life came from non-living elements or non-living conditions. And so assuming that that's the case, based on where science, the body of science currently stands, we do not have enough scientific backing to provide this as the best explanation. At this point, and I would say that the alternative explanation, if we're not fully there yet, would be no explanation. It would just be an admission of we don't know. That would be a better explanation than assuming that life came about through naturalistic processes. And so from the scientific studies that have been done, and yes, there's been some that have shown that you can have organic elements come from non-organic processes, but that's a far cry from getting life. So obviously life is based on organic compounds and chemicals, but you have to do more than just show that you can come up with the alphabet soup for life. You got to not only, once you get the alphabet soup, you got to show how those letters come together to form pretty much books that are the essence of every creature when, as far as amino acids turning into genetic code. And so, but you mentioned there is some significant scientific backing that may be an area where we're going to butt heads on. And so I'm interested in how much you believe the science supports abiogenesis. From 100% rock solid fact, if that was 100%, how much of scientific proof do we have of abiogenesis? Are we, because the last I've heard and what I've looked into, I'd put it more like 15%. There's some things that we can do, but there's a huge gap, canyon-wide gaps of what we're still looking for.
Okay. Is that all? You're good. I can pass the mic back to you if you need more time. Okay. So yeah, so you raised a couple of points. We do not have I tried to get them down as quick as I can. Life came from non-living elements is kind of the way you characterized abiogenesis. We do not have enough scientific backing to provide this as the best explanation. The alternative explanation would be no explanation. We don't know is better than life came about by naturalistic processes. So I'll be the first person to admit that there's a number of things about the origin of life that we still don't know. I mean, that is true for any area of active scientific research. I mean, if there were things that, if there was nothing left that we didn't know, then there would be no further scientific research in any area. There's things about particle physics we still don't know. There's things about evolution that we still don't know. There's things about medicine that we still don't know. Currently have, based on what we do know and based on the research that has been done, suggests that life has a natural explanation. You said that that there's not enough evidence to establish this. Well, that's the only explanation we know that even could be possible based on the available information we have. I realize there's other reasons people might have for believing in alternatives, like people might have spiritual reasons for believing in an alternative reason than in an alternative explanation than abiogenesis. But scientifically, the only information we have points to a naturalistic explanation. So you mentioned that there's this alphabet soup of organic molecules that can be that can occur by natural processes. It's quite a bit more complicated than that, actually. In fact, there was a study published just a couple of years ago in the journal Scientific Reports and led by a team of Italian scientists that found that material from carbon-containing meteorites could catalyze the formation of nucleobases, DNA, RNA bases, amino acids, fatty acids, carboxylic acids, including 70% of the metabolites that occur in the Krebs cycle of modern living cells, which is one of the canonical metabolic pathways. This can all be created through spontaneous chemistry catalyzed by the carbon-containing minerals in meteorites. There was a separate study published a couple of years ago in the journal Nature Communications conducted by chemists at Georgia Tech that reported the spontaneous self-assembly and base pairing of plausible prebiotic nucleotides in water. So again, it's the end product of one spontaneous chemical process that serves as the starting point for the next one. So once you have the spontaneous synthesis of organic building blocks like amino acids or nucleotides, then you have something that can self-assemble into a larger structure. Once you have a larger structure, then you have a lot of variability in the chemical properties. And in some cases, it's been shown that these larger structures can catalyze their own self-replication. And from that, you get mutating replicators that can undergo natural selection.
All right, man, these rounds go pretty quick with a lot of information. So if I'm not responding to one of your more essential points, let me know, because it's hard to write down and then continue to listen. Okay, so you mentioned that there's things that we still don't know about abiogenesis. I'm interested in what are some of the key elements of abiogenesis that we're still unsure of, and so that's kind of a question back to you. And another question I have is, would you agree that the cell is the most basic form of life? If we're talking about life coming from non-living elements, when you get life, would you agree that the cell is the most basic life form that there could be? And okay, so I want to continue my kind of campaign against what science has established and what it hasn't established. And so you mentioned that a few different studies, which interesting. The meteorite one I don't think I had heard of before, but you mentioned that base pairing. Okay, so I have heard of that. I have heard of that experiment before, where they had bases that kind of naturally formed. I guess a question following up with that is, I understand the theory of once you get a self-replicator replicated, once you get that chain reaction going, then you can start to kind of build off, build up from there. However, that's just theory. In all these laboratory experiments, have they ever got a perpetuating self-replicator going? And how many generations has that been possible for? And if it was, I mean, ideally, if they get one going, it would still be going and going and going. But from my knowledge, there is no perpetuating self-replicator. They've gotten them to start up and then go for maybe a certain set of generations, but nothing substantial enough to say, wow, this is exactly how it could have happened back in the days of the primordial ooze. And which and so sure, the meteorite thing, that sounds more compelling than the most arguments. But even if you were able to get, even if you were able to get like proteins to come from outer space, and you got a mix and mingle of proteins and amino acids, one of the things that, from my understanding, in order for DNA to form, or even RNA to form for these amino acids, that dang it. Oh, okay, yeah. Thanks for giving me a little more time. So I'll actually say that argument for the next round. So I'm going to pass it back to you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right about the time, being really quick back and forth. Perhaps if we do a round 2 of this where we focus on evolution, maybe it'd be better to have kind of like a free-flowing back and forth without the 3-minute time limits. I'll leave that up to you to decide for next time. In any case, so you asked me the question, what are some key elements that we're still unsure of as far as filling in the gaps of abiogenesis? Yeah, so there's a couple competing models of how life came into existence. One is the protein first hypothesis, that the very first self-replicating systems that led to the evolution of life were proteins. There's the RNA world hypothesis, which is the it's the model that is based on the idea that RNA molecules are the first self-replicating systems that led to the evolution of life. There's others, for example, like the metabolism first, which proposes that it's the metabolic chemical reactions that actually came first, and then genes that are replicated through some sort of an encoding process came about later on down the line. It's unclear. So back to answer your question, what are some key elements that we're still unsure of? It's unclear which of these hypotheses is correct. There's more evidence that favors the RNA world hypothesis. For example, just based on the features that we know about RNA, like RNA has the information encoding properties of DNA, but it also has some of the properties of proteins as well, like the ability to fold into complex 3-dimensional structures and catalyze chemical reactions. So RNA can perform a lot of the same functions as DNA, as well as some of the same functions as proteins, in the terms of serving as enzymes and catalyzing chemical reactions. You asked me the question, would you agree that the cell is the most basic form of life? Well, not necessarily. It depends on how we define life. I mean, I take the position that there is no specific hard line of to draw between life and non-life. There's more of a continuum between life and non-life. Like, for example, a self-replicating RNA molecule. Would you classify that as a living system or not? I'm not sure. I think it's a little bit ambiguous. Have they ever gotten a perpetuating self-replicator going? Yeah. So the lab of Gerald Joyce, I believe he was at the Scripps Research Institute, has done some work on this, of self-replicating RNA molecules. He published a paper a few years ago, 2014, in a Cell Press journal, basically, that they used in vitro evolution, basically evolution in a test tube, to recover highly efficient self-replicating RNA enzymes, a strand of RNA nucleotides that can make additional copies of itself. I don't have enough time to answer the rest of your questions, but I'll try to get to those in the next round.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for addressing those. I guess a problem I have with, I guess, the general idea of saying that abiogenesis is what science suggests happened is, one, we're dealing with a different kind of science. We're dealing with more of kind of detective science versus directly observational science, right? When's the last time someone debated how many chambers the human heart has? 4, right? No one's going to debate that because we can cut it open. We can fight. If for some reason we forget, we can always, next cadaver, take it out and ask it. So when we're talking about abiogenesis, things that could have happened, ultimately our best link or the best evidence is going to be, well, what have we been able to replicate in laboratories, even though a laboratory is definitely not like the primordial earth, but at least to show us what is possible through different chemicals and possibilities of chemical mixtures. And so one thing you mentioned is like, well, we're unsure of if proteins came first or this metabolic process came first. Well, if that's the case, it's more of it sounds like a chicken and an egg scenario. And the reason we're unsure is because it doesn't necessarily follow that we haven't really scientifically shown or proven that a sustainable metabolic process could form and of its own. And we don't have enough scientific basis to say that a protein manufacturing or a protein synthesizing function could arise on its own first. So it's a chicken and an egg there because there's just a lack of science. And because of that, it should bring up a question mark and bring pause before we provide this as a viable explanation for how life came to be. Talking about even a self-replicating RNA, well, don't you need a ribosome to transfer RNA into proteins in the first place? So where's a ribosome going to come from, which has to be generated by its own, which is a protein generated by RNA in the first place. So there's a major cyclical, a dead end there, or cyclical reasoning that doesn't give us, that begs the question of how could this have come into being on its own? If you need if you need a protein to turn RNA into proteins, where's that first protein come from? Regarding the perpetuating self-replicator by Joyce, how many generations was that able to replicate for before it stopped?
Okay, so picking up where I left off, I'll try to answer your questions in order. Have they ever got a perpetuating self-replicator going? So that one example would be the Gerald Joyce experiment. You said something in your previous round about, if they get one going, it would, would it still be, going and going and going? Not necessarily. It depends on the conditions. Upwards of 99% of all living things that have ever lived on Earth have gone extinct. So it's possible that a self-replicating system can go extinct. All it requires for it to not go extinct and to keep going is just the conditions to favor it, propagating its pattern. Just like a crystal formation is just the propagation of a pattern, so is the replication of an organic molecule. You said something about we're dealing with different kind of science, detective science instead of observational science. In a way, we can't go back in time and see it directly, of course. But what we can do is we can rule out, different competing hypotheses based on which ones are most plausible and which ones conform to our expectations. One of the things we can do is kind of take a bottom up and a top down approach all at the same time. So, like, for example, we can learn things about the earliest life on Earth through things like ancestral sequence reconstruction and molecular phylogenetics. There's some research that is based on not only the ubiquity of or the ubiquitous nature of ribosomes, but also the conservation of their sequences, that the ribosome may itself be an intermediate step in the early evolution of life. What have we been able to replicate in the laboratories to show us what's possible? Well, in addition to the Gerald Joyce experiment, it's not limited to RNA. Another study a few years earlier actually reported that small strands of protein can also self-assemble and self-replicate. So you don't necessarily need RNA or DNA in order for proteins to occur. Amino acids also have self-assembling capabilities under certain conditions. Whether catalytically active RNA molecules came before catalytically active proteins or the other way around, again, that remains an open question. But the point is that they both exist and they both have been, demonstrated to, and documented. So let's see. You said it sounds like a chicken and egg scenario. It hasn't been shown that a sustainable metabolic process can come about. Well, we have all the building blocks for metabolic processes, and some of them have come about. For example, the synthesis of 7 out of the 10 intermediate molecules in the citric acid cycle, for example. I refer to it as the Krebs cycle. It's the same thing. Where does the ribosome come from? That's still an open question. I don't really have an answer. There are still open questions about this area of research. If that wasn't the case, then it wouldn't be an area of research. Where's the first protein come from? Again, it's an open question. However, we do have enough evidence to know that proteins are something that can self-assemble and self-replicate.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, thanks for touching base on those. I'm really interested in what your response to the ribosome RNA problem. If you need a ribosome to turn RNA into proteins, then at least into workable proteins. And ribosome is a protein itself. How does that work? Okay, so you mentioned that the self-replicators that, for example, that Joyce created, that they, it doesn't necessarily mean that he creates one and it should work, because sure, a self-replicator could go extinct, or it could last, for a few repetitions, could last for thousands of repetitions, it could die off. However, in a laboratory where we have a lot more artificial control over the conditions, don't you think we should have we'd see a lot more success, or be able to at least try to keep it going as long as possible to see what would happen? And the fact that there isn't any currently established or any published study of that happening, I think it testifies to the fact that it's a lot more it's a lot more complicated than it's put out. And even on top of that, there's actually more simplified, since we have the more control in the lab, there's more simplified experiments that we could do that could give us more insight into how life could arise. For example, here's a challenge I want to put forth: that you take an elephant, you get a commercial-sized blender, you euthanize the elephant for humane purposes first, you toss it in a blender. And so you blend up an entire elephant. So you have all these kind of proteins and DNA, so on and so forth. And you can, create any kind of chemical concoctions you're going to put that into, zap it with as much voltage as you want. Do you think that's going to create life? Do you think that, what kind of results do you think that would give? Because that kind of that does give us a huge head start on, the mysterious primordial ooze from 4.5 billion years ago on the Earth, or 4 billion years ago, whatever. However, you're still leaps and bounds away from being able to take non-living things into life. The question about the cell as the most basic life form, from my understanding, that's the second law of cell theory, or the second rule of cell theory. The cell is the most basic unit of structure and organization in organisms, or in living organisms. So doesn't that contradict what science has established as cell theory?
So first, what's my response to the ribosome RNA problem? You said that ribosomes is a protein. How could it have come about if RNA came first? Ribosome isn't just a protein. There's ribosomal RNA. In fact, a ribosome is it's a molecular complex that consists of protein interacting with RNA. So the fact that RNA and protein are the only organic molecules that we've been able to observe and document self-assembling, it shouldn't surprise us that the most ubiquitous feature of all living things are made of ribosomes and protein. I don't think that's really a problem. If there's a roadblock or a barrier to natural selection that prevents ribosomes and proteins from being able to interact and being able to use that interaction to make more proteins, I'm not aware of what that block is. So hopefully, perhaps you can clarify for me. don't you think we should see? You asked me the question. Do I think we should see a lot more success in keeping it going? Well, I mean, again, that depends on the conditions. I mean, yeah, the conditions about early Earth, as far as temperature, pH, and where this happened is still an open question. There's a lot of research looking at thermal vents, for example. In fact, deep sea thermal vents. The study I mentioned earlier about using meteorites, for example, to synthesize amino acids and nucleotide bases and a bunch of other organic molecules. The most successful results they got was using thermal water. So they combined formamide, a really simple organic molecule, carbonaceous meteorites, carbon-containing meteorites, and thermal water. And then they incubated at warm temperature. And that's when they recovered the greatest abundance of these organic molecules. And once you have these organic molecules, they can interact with each other. And depending on their interaction, some of them can self-assemble and form larger, more complex structures. Let's see. So I guess I'll just go ahead and jump around a little bit. Elephant in a blender analogy. It wouldn't necessarily give us a head start on the primordial on what you refer to as the primordial ooze. An elephant has a microbiome. As soon as it gets put in a blender, there's bacteria that are going to eat and lead to the decay of the elephant. So it's a little bit of a false analogy. It doesn't necessarily replicate the conditions on the early Earth. The cell is the most basic unit of life, not necessarily, because it's the most basic unit of life as far as we know in the modern world. But again, we're trying to talk about how life originated, and the evidence seems to show that, I'll go ahead and say that, all the available evidence we have, as limited as it may be, is pointing to these are the features of life that we can, put in a laboratory in a test tube and study are things that can self-assemble and self-replicate. And I'll have to get to the next round to respond to the rest.
All right. So regarding the elephant in the blender thing, yeah, I understand that there's, many different. It's more complicated than that because you have the bacteria. But assuming you were able to neutralize all the bacteria, so you're starting with just all the pure proteins and the DNA from that, and you drop it in, whatever. That would be a head start, because we're talking about, you have all the amino acids, you have not only RNA, but you have DNA, you have cells, right? You got all sorts of cells happening. And so I would just assume that would be able to, we could start with, living things, kill them, and then work on their inner parts to see what could, sounds pretty sadistic, but you could work from that standpoint to see what you can actually manipulate with the cell to see what's actually possible there, as opposed to the behind the curtain 4 billion years ago and conditions that we are that we're relatively unaware of or unsure of. I want to speak to the nature of what I believe abiogenesis is originating from. And I believe that abiogenesis fits into a naturalistic, the meta narrative of naturalism, the belief that from nature can come everything. And I think that's actually not the best, that is not founded on sound science. And so when we get to abiogenesis, that pretty much reaches into the same miracle bag that cosmologists have to reach into to actually get the material to start the Big Bang. So it's not that we have to debate the Big Bang and everything, but ultimately you're saying the Big Bang states that there's nothing and then there's something. And I know there's a lot of different theories going on with that, whether nothing is really nothing, but it's still it's still beyond nature. It's still almost a supernatural occurrence. When you have life coming from non-life, that also has the very haunting echoes of a supernatural thing happening there. How could natural non-living stuff all of a sudden turn out life? And think about the conversation that we're having as we're matching our minds against each other. The very idea of the mind originating from something that has no consciousness, is that even possible? To me, that just seems reasonably impossible.
Okay, yeah, I think I'll try to handle in reverse order if I can, since I can't let consciousness go. Yeah, so all the evidence we have about consciousness suggests that this is something that requires a physical brain, and brains are the process of evolution, or the, I should say, not process, the product of evolution. There's there's tons of experiments we can get into. In fact, I have a debate challenge up about consciousness if you'd like to take me up on it. But um, you know, we can do chemical manipulations on the brain. The field of anesthesiology is based on this. We can very finely tune brain activity and see what happens to consciousness as we put the patient in like an fMRI, for example. So we have very good evidence that consciousness is the product of a physical brain. And a brain itself, we have good evidence from genetics, is the product of evolution. Uh, Going a little bit further back, life coming from non-life has the haunting echoes of a supernatural thing happening. I don't really see the evidence of that. If there is something, not that I'm trying to put words in your mouth, but if there is something conscious or intelligent about the origin of life, I don't know if you're an intelligent design advocate, for example, but that would presuppose that consciousness can exist independently of a brain, and that's something for which we have no evidence. So again, I'm even though I admit, right from the start that there's a lot of holes in our knowledge about what happened on the early Earth and how life came about, the requisite causal phenomena that I'm proposing and the underlying mechanisms through which those phenomena work are all known to be parts of the real world. So like we can dissect the cell, for example, and see what it's made out of, and we can see that these components can come about naturally and that they can self-assemble and they can self-replicate. And these are the basic steps that need to happen in order to go from non-life to life. You need to have the organic synthesis driving the production of organic building blocks like amino acids and nucleotides. Once you have these, once these things exist, you need to have additionally the self-replication of them, or excuse me, the self-assembly of them. And then once they exist in a larger structure composed of many of these building blocks, then they need to be able to self-replicate. And once they can self-replicate, they need to be able to mutate and undergo natural selection towards towards increasing complexity. Each of these individual steps that have to happen have been documented individually. So even though we can't go back in time and see the entire process unfold in front of us, the requisite steps that are required for a natural process leading from non-life to life have been documented. You said it fits into a naturalistic meta-narrative. I mean, not necessarily. Science just presupposes methodological naturalism. It doesn't take a philosophical stance on naturalism. I'm not, this isn't a theism versus atheism debate. I could say that, if there is a God, everything I've said so far still stands. I mean, it could just be that God set the laws of nature in motion and we still have a natural explanation for the origin and evolution of life.
All right. You mentioned something I found interesting. So you said that regarding consciousness, and I agree that could demand its own debate, and will definitely show up in my thoughts when we talk about evolution. But you mentioned that there's no proof of that. There's no proof of consciousness. The idea that consciousness can exist outside of the physical, or outside of like a physical brain, which I think is fair. However, I'm not sure you've given me substantial proof that life can come from non-life. Now, you did mention the series of steps that have been documented, but I'm curious, like, how close have we gotten from taking inorganic molecules to actually building, getting them started and generating a life form? So sure, someone can create a self-replicator, but from my understanding, that self-replicators, those are not continuing to be self-replicating. It's not, we have found nothing that's sustainable enough to get us in the direction of life. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the self-replicators, they don't, how many genes or proteins, novel genes or proteins have they been able to synthesize when these replicators get going? So just how complex have these self-replicators gotten? And do you think, and I mean, if it's, from my understanding, it's not that complex. It's kind of a, maybe raise an eyebrow of like, okay, that's an interesting experiment. But as far as bridging the canyon wide gap from non-life to life, I think they still fall far short. And so That's my understanding, and I want to hear if you have evidence that that corrects me on that. Because sure, amino acids, the alphabet soup, the alphabet is one thing, but you need to show me how the alphabet's going to assemble itself into a Shakespearean play complex level of complexity, which the most basic life form, which like an E. coli bacteria, represents. It's still super complex, even though it's one of the most basic. So that's why I believe that abiogenesis is not a good explanation. I think it's actually a bad explanation because it presumes too much. It presumes that just because we've been able to see amino acids form, a few proteins form, a self-replicating thing happening. So you bunch all that together, it's not enough to say. If you can show me a cell's being created, then I think you have a better argument.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate it. So you said that it presumes too much. I'd have a better argument if I can show cells being created. Yeah, I mean that is quite a big canyon, but I mean the canyon is, if it's filled at all, it's going to be filled with incremental steps. I mean you have to have the molecules that are required to make life in order to have life, for example. There's again, I laid out a number of steps that have to happen in order to go from non-life to life. There's documentation for them. I can put the links in the to the papers that I've cited, for example, in the comments section below. Bridging the canyon, these steps fall short. I'm not sure how. I'm not sure where the line is between non-life and life. I mean, every single major milestone that needs to be hit in order to go from non-life to life has been documented. The origin of the genetic code itself, you mentioned something about a Shakespearean play. It's also subject of ongoing investigation with some very promising results. For example, there's some evidence to suggest that the genetic code evolved out of interactions between protein and RNA that favored protein flexibility. For example, a paper published a few years ago, 2013, I think, by a study by scientists at the University of Illinois, found that certain amino acid combinations that required the emergence of the genetic code are disproportionately more abundant in the parts of proteins that are more flexible. So, and in the catalytically active site of enzymes. So this suggests that RNA-protein interactions that contribute to protein flexibility and function are evolutionarily adaptive, and hence the structural features of RNA that facilitate those interactions would also be adaptive. And so this is just what we call the genetic code, is structural features of RNA that facilitate protein function and flexibility. And we have natural selection, we have mutation, we have mechanisms that can generate this from simpler precursors. They're not continuing to be self-replicating, the molecules that they invented. Yeah, they don't have to be. They've shown that they can exist, and there's a whole bunch of reasons involving predation and bacteria that use these as food for as reasons for why they are not necessarily sustainable today as the way they would be billions of years ago. But in any case, the underlying causal mechanisms are known to be real in the real world. That's my argument.
All right, so you said every milestone has been hit as far as these experiments laying out step by step how life could come from non-life. I just think that's wrong. I don't think that's right. I think if that was true, then you could actually create life in a laboratory. And from my understanding, we have not been able to start with chemicals and create life. Why is that? Well, you look at what you need to get things going, and it is just a super complex. When you talk about life, breaks down to DNA. In order to get a program that's going to be able to live, whether it self-replicates or not, you're dealing with a super complex level of organization and coding that is beyond our levels of intelligence to do. We can't even build our own virus. We manipulate viruses because even those are so complex. If we could, then that would revolutionize a lot of different things that we could do with medicine. And so scientifically, we see a super higher order complexity to what you need to make life. And we aren't even able to hold, not even a candle, we aren't even able to hold a lit match to our ability to be able to create this stuff. If we could, then it'd be a slam dunk problem, and that would be a great explanation, but it's not. I want to close with this quote by Harold Urey, who pioneered one of the experiments in organic amino acids, or generating those. And he says, We all believe as an article of faith that life evolved from dead matter on this planet. It is just that its complexity is so great